Chapter 45. World Class. Over the years, Fritz von Erich and I had numerous conversations about important business matters, and I was privy to everything and anything when it came to his booking office. Even when I wasn't his booker, I was still one of his top confidants, and he would regularly call me and ask my opinion on all things pertaining to his wrestling business. In early 1986, Fritz called me and told me he was considering seceding from the NWA, because after Kerry lost the NWA title to Ric Flair in 1984, the NWA board assured Fritz that he would get it back, but kept reneging. By 1986, Fritz had reached an I'll show them mentality, and was threatening to withdraw his membership over it. I was totally against the move, implored him to reconsider, and even told him it would be the kiss of death for his territory. For years the Texas booking office had presented the National Wrestling Alliance as the premier wrestling organization in the world. I reminded him how we brought in Ric Flair, Harley Race, Lou Thesz, Pat O'Connor, and the Funks, and the NWA was our centerpiece. By leaving, I pointed out the Texas office would become just like what we ridiculed, the WWF and the American Wrestling Alliance, secondary and no longer affiliated with the best of the best. Nobody in Texas took the WWF or the American Wrestling Alliance seriously, and I knew they wouldn't take his promotion seriously, either. The other reason I knew it would be a horrible mistake was because it was a decision made out of rage, and you never do yourself a favor when you let your emotions sway important decisions. Unfortunately, Fritz was very controlling, and wanted to be in control of his destiny, and the world title. For him to come off as Fritz von Erich the tough guy boss was more important to him than abiding by the NWA rules. I felt that by him doing something that detrimental to his own business, he either hated himself or had just gotten too damn arrogant to play nicely with others, and I don't think he hated himself. When the announcement was made in February 1986, it was a humongous deal in the wrestling world, because Fritz was the first ex-president to leave the NWA. Yes, looking back one can say the NWA was disintegrating anyhow, but Fritz left the NWA before it was at the point of being non-existent. Jimmy Crockett was doing big business in the Carolinas, Bob Geigel was still doing business in Kansas City, Don Owen was still in operation in Portland, and the Florida promotion was alive, as well. Being a member of the NWA was crucial, because if he needed help with a big show to fend off a competitor, other promoters would send their top guys in to help him out. Plus, if he ever needed a new booker, he could have asked the other promoters if there were any booking assistants out there who could come and take the reins in Texas. As you'll read in this chapter, that really could have come in handy. However, because he was no longer a part of the NWA, he would have no one to turn to. It was a tremendous loss. He was also going to miss out on having a great world champion like Ric Flair. I talk about how amazing the Von Erich boys were, but keep in mind that Rick was one of the guys wrestling them in those classic matches. When I was Fritz's booker, I had access to the world champion on a regular basis. Even if business wasn't going well, I knew that if I brought in Rick for a week, I could get at least half a house because the NWA title was money in the bank. It meant that much, and had a tremendous impact. Even though the Texas wrestling fans loved the Von Erichs and Bruiser Brody, they also loved Ric Flair, because he was a class act and something special. How could Fritz replace him as the only world champion in the fans' minds? There was no way to replace that. Ric Flair was a very important part of Texas wrestling, as was Harley Race before him. Sure, Fritz could create his own world champion, and he did, but the Texas fans were conditioned to believe there was only one world title that mattered. Even though they were fans of Texas wrestling, they were indoctrinated like the rest of the NWA fans that if it didn't say NWA, then it wasn't a world title, it was a regional title. I knew that was how Texas wrestling fans would look at Fritz's promotion, and no matter how he spun it, it would never be the same. You just don't spend decade after decade, champion after champion, hurling the National Wrestling Alliance at your audience and then one day just say they're not relevant. I actually didn't know how much more the Texas fans would take. David and Gino had died under suspicious circumstances, and now Fritz had to announce to them that he was leaving the NWA. This was a new era for Texas wrestling, and he was entering uncharted territory. Since he was no longer running the Texas booking office for the NWA, he decided to call his new promotion World Class. Up until that point, World Class Championship Wrestling was simply the name of one of his TV shows, equivalent to what Raw is for the WWE today. Since the 1960s, the actual promotion name had been Southwest Sports, but now, once he broke away from the NWA, what originally started as one of his TV shows became the name of his promotion. I know that in the interest of ease and simplicity, wrestling magazines would refer to the Texas territory as World Class during the early 80s, but they were technically wrong. It's also incorrect to refer to World Class Championship Wrestling prior to 1981, because it never even existed in the 1970s. I really can't blame people from doing it, though, and it's a testament to the huge popularity of the World Class Championship Wrestling program. But the fact is that World Class was not a promotion prior to 1986, and it's actually incorrect to refer to it as such. And if you need hard proof, simply watch one of the KTVT Saturday night shows prior to 1986, and you'll notice that the words World Class were never even uttered. And in March of 1986, just 1 month after Fritz withdrew from the NWA, his booker Ken Mantell quit the company and became the booker for Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling. It was a shocking defection, because when he left, he took Kamala, John Tatum, Missy Hyatt, the Missing Link, Jack Victory, Sunshine, Bill Irwin, Solomon Grundy, and Iceman King Parsons with him. He literally depleted World Class of its talent pool. For bookers, the kiss of death is to leave a territory and take a lot of talent with you. Not only does it show that you are not to be trusted, but if you had no problem burning your bridge with your previous boss, what makes the man who is hiring you think you wouldn't eventually screw him over, as well? Buddy Rogers was infamous for doing that. He took the book in Columbus, Ohio for promoter Al Haft in the late 1950s and brought his crew in, which consisted of Johnny Valentine, Arnold Skolland, Billy Darnell, Johnny Barrett, and Magnificent Maurice. They were drawing big money and blew the place sky high. However, once Buddy didn't get his way, he took all his talent and left. That garnered him a very bad reputation, and forever after, Buddy Rogers was looked at as a booker who could make a lot of money and had good talent connections, but when he left, he took his boys with him. I learned that lesson back then, and was also told by Mark Lewin early on that a good booker doesn't take their whole crew with them when they leave a territory. As soon as Ken split from Texas, I got a call from David Manning, who had been Ken Mantell's assistant. He asked me if I would consider returning to World Class because their talent pool had been so severely depleted. Without hesitation, I agreed to come back. Now, if you're wondering why I would return to World Class after it suffered the life-threatening double whammy I just detailed, I have 2 solid reasons. First of all, Dallas was my home, and I could work there and be home at night with my family. Secondly, and more importantly, it was clear to me that Bill Watts and Ken Mantell had gotten in bed together with ambitions of overtaking Texas, and I resented that they were looking to destroy a territory that I helped build. By late 1985, Bill Watts was looking to expand his company, and since he already had Houston locked up in a deal with Paul Bosch, he figured the next move would be to secure all of Texas. At the same time, because Fritz wasn't the easiest guy in the world to work for, Ken Mantell was constantly under a barrage of criticism. Bill Watts was smart enough to see the divide between the two of them, step in, and take advantage of it. He convinced Ken that if he helped sabotage Fritz's wrestling company, he would make room for him in his promotion, and cut him in on the action. Ken must have been harboring a lot of resentment towards Fritz to have gotten in bed with Bill like that. I know that Ken felt he wasn't being financially taken care of by Fritz. I also know he was never paid as well as I was, because in addition to my weekly booking salary, I got a % of the towns over the average, and I also got paid for being Gary Hart the manager. Ken never got my deal with the averages, but even if he did, he wouldn't have made that much money, because I had gotten the averages so high by 1983 that it could only go down. He also didn't have an on-air role in any capacity, so he was really just making his weekly booking salary, whatever that was. If Ken felt justified leaving in the reckless manner he did because he was resentful over the deal he made with Fritz, then I cannot sympathize with him. I never took a job I couldn't live with, and Ken should have made sure that his financial deal with Fritz was satisfactory going in. However, because Ken had never booked a territory before he got the book in Texas, he really didn't know what to ask for. In any event, after listening to Ken's constant crying and whining about the deal that he had made for himself, Bill realized how easy it would be to get Ken to jump ship. The sad thing is that Fritz truly thought Ken was his friend, and really trusted him. Once Bill and Ken made their deal, since Ken was Fritz's booker and Bill was Fritz's supposed friend, they independently began encouraging him to leave the NWA by stroking his ego, telling him he didn't need the NWA. They played Fritz like a fiddle and took advantage of his animosity over the fact that the NWA board wouldn't give Kerry the NWA title back, and used that to get Fritz to break away from the NWA. That was all a part of their grand scheme, and believe me, Bill and Ken were big-time schemers. They wanted Fritz to be independent of the NWA just like Bill was, before they made their move, because they knew that as soon as Fritz left the NWA it would put him on an island by himself, where he would lose the opportunity to get help from the other offices when they made their move. After getting Fritz to secede from the NWA, the next piece of the puzzle was for Ken to leave with as much of Fritz's talent as he could get to go with him. And if you think what I'm saying sounds like some wacky conspiracy theory, you also need to realize that Bill Watts had quietly opened up a set of offices in Dallas, aligned himself with a Dallas-based syndicator and a multimillionaire backer who owned some of the biggest hotels in Texas, changed the name of his company from the regional-sounding Mid-South Wrestling to the Universal Wrestling Federation, began doing television tapings in Fort Worth, and started running shows in Dallas. Now if all of that doesn't add up to a blueprint for Bill and Ken plotting to overtake and control Texas, then I don't know what would. Fritz was truly blindsided by what they were doing, so if I could help World Class by returning, I was more than happy to do it. When I arrived in World Class, I could see that business was really bad. The territory appeared to be plunging into obscurity, and the only worthwhile talent was Bruiser Brody, Abdullah the Butcher, Rick Rude, and Kevin and Kerry Von Erich. I had been away for a year and a half, so the fans were excited to see me again. I was an established name by that time, and since the fans knew that I only managed top-flight wrestlers, they knew that good talent was on the way. After the promotion was dubbed World Class, Fritz anointed Rick Rude to be the first World Class World Champion. Unfortunately, as I expected, the fans never really accepted him or took him seriously, because they felt that Ric Flair was the real World Champion. And how couldn't they? Rick was showing up on TBS every week and appearing on the cover of every wrestling magazine with his NWA belt. It's too bad, because Rick was a very nice kid and he had way too much talent to be put in a no-win situation like that. Eventually, the frustration got to Rick, and when he told me he got an offer from Jimmy Crockett, I encouraged him to take it, knowing he would do great. Fritz's first mistake was leaving the NWA, but his second one was when he promoted David Manning to the position of booker. I had originally hired David as a referee back when I had the book. Then, after I left, he became Ken Mantell's assistant. After Ken left, he was basically just thrown into the booking job. Some of David's suggestions and ideas were very good, but he wasn't able to look at things and see them for what they were, because he hadn't been around long enough to see a lot of different scenarios. A good booker who has been around will innately know what will and what won't work. You may take a chance on something against your better judgment, but unless you have the experience of a lifetime in wrestling, it's very hard to set direction for a company. David Manning did not have that experience, but since he was a workaholic, he was the guy that Fritz picked to do the job. A booking job is a lot more than meets the eye, though. Anyone can go to the dressing room and give out finishes or see the obvious, but that doesn't mean they can run a wrestling company. David was clearly in over his head, and didn't even have control over the dressing room, let alone the direction of the company. For example, Kevin Von Erich and Buzz Sawyer had a feud that was heating up, both inside the ring and out. During their matches, they never came to blows, but their matches were very stiff. This went on until things got so bad that Kevin decided it needed to be settled through fisticuffs. Kevin wrote Buzz a letter offering to fight him, even giving him the location where to meet him. Buzz actually showed me the letter. This had gone too far, but fortunately, before it got out of hand, both of them felt it was best to just back off. Then, Blackjack Mulligan came into the territory. Rick Hazard, the referee, was speaking rudely to Blackjack, and Jack is not the type of guy who lets anyone disrespect him. I warned Rick to leave Jack alone, but he kept pestering him about something. It eventually got to a point where Jack roughed up Rick a bit, shoved him in a locker, and left him there for a while. Those two examples are so clear that even Ray Charles would have seen that World Class had no one leading the charge. After 5 months, Fritz finally realized that he had erred in making David Manning the booker, and in August 1986, brought George Scott in to replace him. George was a quality big-name booker, who had great success in the Carolinas and the WWF. I was glad to see George, because at least he knew about wrestling, had an idea about direction, and had been a successful booker. George was the quintessential office guy. When he arrived, he had his rules and regulations, and expected us to adhere to what he thought the way things were supposed to be. I never had any problems with him, because I always respected him. I respect people that had success as bookers, because I know how hard it is. Plus, to be successful for a long period of time like George was, and be successful in more than one place, demanded that I respect him. I looked at George Scott as an equal, and as someone who was more than capable of running World Class. Unfortunately, his tenure was marred by behind-the-scenes drama and office politics. World Class had run a show in the Caribbean, and on the flight back to Dallas, Chris Adams got inebriated and wanted more drinks. When the stewardess refused, Chris cursed her out. At that point, the second officer of the plane came out to the aisle and read Chris the riot act. Chris then grabbed him by the lapels and head-butted him, closing up his eyes and breaking his nose. This was the second officer of the airplane, so effectively, it was a plane 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, and if something happened to the captain, there was nobody else there to fly it. Kevin and Carrie Von Erich and Tim Brooks had to wrestle Chris down until he passed out, and when the plane landed in Dallas, federal marshals came on board and arrested him. The company knew that this was a huge issue, because it wasn't an isolated incident. Chris had a serious problem, because whenever he drank too much he became violent. Real violent. So when it came time for the trial, Fritz and Kevin wouldn't testify on Chris's behalf. Fritz felt that Chris had acted irresponsibly, and that he brought shame to World Class. In addition to that, Fritz was someone who really didn't want to get involved in anything scandalous. God knows he was surrounded by enough. All he wanted to do was protect the Von Erich name, because he had spent his lifetime building it, and I don't blame him for that. In Chris's mind, he felt that the Von Erichs owed him loyalty, not only out their friendship, but because of how long he had worked for them. Chris brought his problems on himself. What he did that day on the plane was way out of line, and Chris was wrong. Due to that incident, he spent over a year in federal prison. I used to write him and call him whenever I could, and tried to be as good a friend to him as he had always been to me. I considered Chris one of my boys, and since I made a lot of money with him over the years, I sent him money every month out of my own pocket. I'm happy to say that he held up very well in prison. Chris was a tough Englishman who could survive in any atmosphere. When he came out, he was clean of any drugs. His stay in prison was like a forced rehab. He didn't have access to alcohol or medication of any kind, and he sobered up cold turkey. He really looked fabulous, but shortly after his demons brought him back to his old habits. What made things even more troubling is that Chris was our world champion at the time of the airplane incident, so when he went to prison, George Scott anointed Black Bart as his replacement. That was one of George's moments of shame. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing the matter with Black Bart, but he was a middle of the card, get someone ready, tag team partner, not world champion material. We're talking about someone to be the same image of Ric Flair, Harley Race, and Carrie Von Erich. Black Bart was not in that ballpark. The choosing of Black Bart as our world champion raised a lot of eyebrows, including mine, but it was another move of George's that really led me to believe that he had lost a step over the years. When Bam Bam Bigelow arrived in World Class, he was a bump-taking, decent worker who had flames tattooed on his head. Perhaps more importantly, though, he had just gotten written up in Sports Illustrated, and was pretty high profile at the time of his arrival. So what did George Scott do when Bam Bam arrived in World Class to capitalize on that great, free publicity? He changed his name to Crusher Yurkov and made him a Russian. George just couldn't get away from the past in his thinking. He had come from the WWF where Nikolai Volkov was a big heel, and the Mid-Atlantic area, where Ivan Koloff was the menacing, evil bad guy. That was George's mentality, that a Russian is better than a character. And trust me, the fact that Terry Gordy's nickname was Bam Bam had absolutely nothing to do with George's decision. First of all, Terry was working for Bill Watts at the time, and even if he was with World Class, it would have been A+. George could have promoted the Battle of the Bam Bams. You would have to be a fool not to see that. Then George brought Ricky Steamboat, who was wrestling full-time for the WWF, into World Class for just one match at the Cotton Bowl. I thought that was very strange, because he promoted Ricky like everyone would know who he was, but the World Class fans didn't have any idea who he was. Yes, Ricky was on the USA Network, but this was before cable was dominant, and George didn't understand that unless you were a Von Erich or a Bruiser Brody, you weren't considered big time in World Class unless you came in and built up a following in Texas. George brought Ricky in with absolutely no build-up, and by doing it that way it was a disservice to everyone, especially Ricky. Now had he brought Ricky into World Class and given him a few wins on TV, Ricky really would have caught on with the fans, and it would have been a great thing. George knew who Ricky Steamboat was and how great he was, but the World Class fans didn't know that, and they needed to be educated. To top it off, Ricky was a great worker, yet for his big appearance George booked him against the mighty Zulu, who couldn't work a lick. Those particular booking decisions had a lot of people in the company questioning George's mindset, and gave credence to the rumors that were circulating about him at the time, that he had a different agenda than he was leading Fritz to believe. Word on the street was that George Scott was sent in by Jimmy Crockett or Vince McMahon to sabotage World Class. I'm sure they saw Texas as a big cherry that they would love to have, because it's right in the middle of the country and has 9 big towns. One could argue that if they did have their eyes on the Texas market, it's possible that George was sent in to scuttle and disrupt. But the suspicion wasn't on my part. I considered the rumors just dressing room politician talk, and paid them no mind. Besides, if George had that type of agenda, I know I would have picked up on it. Fritz might have taken those rumors as fact, though, and decided to let George go. So if sabotage was George's agenda, Fritz caught him real quickly, because he was only in world class for 4 months. After George Scott left, nobody, myself included, wanted the booking job, and World Class was in disarray. World Class, the television show that made the wrestling world take a look, had turned into a disastrous promotion. With nowhere else to turn, and basically by default, Fritz made Bruiser Brody the booker. And then it got bad. And when I say bad, I mean really bad. I want to make this very clear, I love Bruiser Brody to death, but a booker he was not. He had a list of good guys and a list of bad guys, and he put the good guys against the bad guys. Not only was Brody ill-prepared for the job, but for Fritz to believe that he was capable of handling a position like that, he had to be pissing in the wind, or hoping against hope. As soon as he started, Bruiser Brody came up with this harebrained scheme, telling me, "I've got this guy who I'm going to dress up like a mercenary. All he needs is you to talk for him." He was referring to a wrestler he was trying to develop named Jeep Swenson. I gave it a shot and agreed to manage him. It was a disaster. When I first walked him to the ring, he went out there and stunk up the joint. God knows I was there, standing side by side with him, making a fool of myself. I did it again with Nor the Barbarian, and made a fool of myself with him, too. However, I did it for Bruiser Brody. He was my buddy, and if he was standing knee-deep in shit, then I was going to stand in shit with him. And if he was going to fail, then I was going to fail with him. I owed that to him. It's hard to tell a friend of mine no, and it's also very hard to tell a friend that he doesn't have an eye for talent. Everyone thinks they do. Look at Ric Flair. He is one of the greatest wrestlers in the world, but doesn't have a clue how to get anyone else over. It's one thing creating your own image, but to branch out and develop other guys is something that very few people have the ability to do. Thank God I was blessed with that ability. It was an innate ability, and not something I learned how to do. I had that in me from the beginning. The only thing I did was learn how to use it, structure it in a positive way, and be choosy about the people I chose to develop. I was only kidding myself when I agreed to manage Jeep Swenson. Mike Von Erich had been wrestling for a while. Mike was a smaller version of David, and really gave wrestling everything he had. We all loved him so much and would do anything we could to get him over, even giving him Tim Brooks's theme song, Tough Enough by the Fabulous Thunderbirds, because he liked it so much. Over a series of matches, Mike severely injured his shoulder, and had to get an operation. When Mike got his injury, the office came up with this idea that Mike hit Tim Brooks in the jaw so hard that he threw his shoulder out. They approached me with that story to see what I thought, and I told them it was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. They argued that it would make Mike look strong, but I pointed out that no one would believe that anyone could hit someone so hard that they can dislocate their shoulder, yet the person they hit doesn't have a broken jaw. However, that's what the office wanted, so Tim and I went out to do an interview and told the story, but nobody ever believed us, and it got over like a fart in church. That whole period was just nonsense and silliness. After Mike's operation, he came down with toxic shock syndrome, which is typically a disease that women get if they leave their tampons in too long. Apparently, sometime during his surgery, his doctor left a surgical tool in him and sewed him up. Mike got really sick, and he looked like a skeleton. He was in the hospital for a long time, and we thought that he was going to die. That's when the Von Erich curse term started coming up. Mike was literally just touch and go for a few weeks. His temperature was so high that the doctors were worried that it would affect his mental capacity if he survived. Kevin went on TV on multiple occasions and kept people updated with Mike's condition, and asked for prayer, which they got. Mike did recover and return to the ring, but he was never the same again. Let's be honest though, Mike had unbelievable shoes to fill. Not only those of his father, but of his brothers as well. Mike was following 4 legendary Von Erichs, and it wasn't going to be an easy thing. The people liked him and accepted him, but there was no way they wouldn't compare him to his brothers. Mike received a strong push, but unfortunately the stress of not being on the same level as the Von Erichs before him, as well getting a disease that almost took his life due to a careless doctor, affected his thinking process, and he did a lot of outlandish things. In separate incidents, he got into a car accident, attacked a doctor at the hospital, and at one point, smashed up a Volkswagen with a crowbar. That was not Mike. Mike was a sweet, nice, peaceful kid, who loved to write music and play his guitar. That was Mike. All of those violent instances were very uncharacteristic of him. One day, I walked into Fritz's office, and he was sitting there with a note in his hand. He showed me the note, and I read it. It was from Mike. To paraphrase it, he wrote that he had brought shame to the Von Erich name due to his recent violent outbursts, and he thought it would be best if he ended it all. He also specified that he wanted to give his guitar, songbooks, and etchings to his brother, Chris, who had an artistic flair, as well. It was a goodbye letter, Actually, he left 2 notes, one for his parents, and one for Chris. The one that Fritz had was the one that was left for him and Doris. We were all hoping that Mike was just begging for attention, and that what he wrote wasn't true. I left the office that day and went to San Angelo for an outdoor show that Carrie was headlining. When I got there, I went way up to the top of the stadium and stood there watching the sun go down. I couldn't stop thinking about that poor family, and how it was happening to them again. I hurt so much I felt numb. The hurt wasn't so much for Mike, because I knew he was where he wanted to be, and hopefully was in a better place, but I had to see his parents and his brothers go through another horrible tragedy. As I looked out over the horizon, it hit me. My nephew and Carrie's brother is missing and probably dead, yet we're in San Angelo for a wrestling match. It was all so strange, and we were just operating on autopilot that night. After Mike didn't show up for a couple of days, I knew it was grim, but nobody knew where he went to do the deed. Those days were really hard. Fritz was trying to be strong and Doris was falling apart. Then, I woke up one morning, and there was something about Mike on TV. The Channel 8 news team was at Lake Dallas, where there was a little cove where Mike used to play his guitar and write his poetry. He apparently went there, got into a sleeping bag, and took a bottle of Placidals and 2 beers. That's what I woke up to that day. The image of Doris standing next to the ambulance as they put her son's body in there. What a horrific sight. That was a very bad time at World Class, but at the same time, it was just one more big heap of misery piled onto everything that had happened before. It was becoming really hard to be a world-class fan in a lot of ways. We were a family-oriented promotion, and we encouraged our audience to watch us as a family. But after being turned off by the deaths and scandals, it got to a point where families stopped watching. By losing the families, we lost the casual fans. Casual fans made up 60% of our audience, so that was a huge loss. The most important element for big business in wrestling is the casual fan, and once you lose them, it's tough to get them back. It was also very dangerous, because we could get by doing so-so business in our regular weekly towns, but when we would go to the big buildings, we had to do big. We couldn't afford not to draw, because it's super expensive. It cost $25,000 to rent Texas Stadium for one night, and that's just the rent, and not the cleanup and the security forces. If we booked it and didn't draw well, we would be in big trouble. Yet, we plowed ahead and still booked Texas Stadium for the Parade of Champions in May 1987. Who in their right mind would do something like that? It made no sense. Mike died 1 month before the annual Texas Stadium show, and something happened that really upset me. Fritz made it the David and Mike Von Erich Memorial Show. That pissed me off. I saw the grief, but at the same time, I saw the greed. I couldn't comprehend how, with the grief that was in his heart, he had the wherewithal to make it a David and Mike Memorial to make more money off of it. This was his 3rd son who had died, and I know it horribly affected him. I sat in his office with him and talked about it, and I also spoke with him late at night on the phone about it. I knew what great pain Mike's death caused Fritz and his whole family, but at the same time, I saw him using it as a promotional tool. Money is not the most important thing, but Fritz's greed overcame his emotion for his tremendous loss. I may be many things, but I'm not like that. I hated the idea, and I hated Fritz for doing it, too. Renaming the show didn't put one more ass in the seats, but it sure sold more pictures of Mike. For the first memorial show in 1984, over 32,000 fans showed up. In 1985, it dipped to 26,000, and in 1986, there was a turnout of 24,000. Now, in 1987, just 1 year later, we drew less than 6,000 fans. If you think about it, though, why should anyone have come? With matches featuring Jeep Swenson and Nor the Barbarian, and a 6-woman mud pit match, it had total disaster written all over it. Bruiser Brody even booked himself in a match against me. What a weak card. It was terrible, and on that night, I was ashamed to walk to the ring. During the show, Fritz came to me and told me he wasn't happy with Brody's job as booker. He didn't have to explain why, I could see the house. I told him, you had to know what you were getting into when you replaced George Scott with Bruiser Brody just 4 months before your biggest show of the year. At least George had a concept of what it takes to be a booker and how to build for a big show. Brody doesn't have that knowledge or experience. I'm tired of running a non-profit organization, Fritz sighed. Will you please help me run this place again?